Today, coming along, I'll be talking about something that is commonly talked about. You may have even done it yourself, but it's been on my mind for a while, and I'll be talking about fasting. First of all, before I go into talking about or discussing what fasting is, it will be important to start by looking at what fasting is not. Fasting is not hunger strike. You might have heard of people that have decided they will not eat for one reason or the other. It could be political issues. It could be humanitarian issues where they decide until their case is sorted, they're not going to eat. That's not fasting. That's just hunger strike. Fasting is also not calorie restriction. There are people that decide to restrict themselves from calories because maybe they're trying to lose weight and things like that. That's not fasting. It's as the name suggests, just restricting calories. But now that we have defined what fasting is not, let us define what fasting is. Fasting is where you stop eating completely or almost completely for a certain stretch of time. Well, one of the typical ways you can think about fasting is, for example, when you go to bed in the night, you don't eat for a couple of hours that you're sleeping. So that's a stretch of time. That is, if you sleep, let's say 6 or 8 out to 8 hours or more. But then if you're eating breakfast and then you don't eat and then you eat lunch, you can't say in between your fasting because the stretch of time is not long enough. So you're stopping eating completely or almost completely for a certain stretch of time, and this could be for many different reasons. So let's begin by looking at the purposes of fasting. So why do people restrict themselves or stop themselves from eating? First of all, it could be for religious or spiritual reasons. So this could be, for example, Christians fast as a way of humbling themselves before God. So as a way of telling the flesh, you don't really own me, but I'm going to spend this time where I could have been eating so that I can humble myself before God. Muslims as well do a similar thing during Ramadan for a whole month. They don't eat for a window of period of time from the sunset to to the rising of the sun. So they have those restriction of times when they do not eat, and these are mainly to fill for those people that are hungry who do not have food, but also is a way of honoring their religion, which is something that they do on religious grounds. But also there can be health related reasons where people can fast, which is mainly deciding like, okay, not necessarily deciding, but it could be medical interventions. For example, if you're going to do a glucose test, for example, fasted glucose test to test for things like pre-diabetes or diabetes itself, they will normally ask you to be able to stay away from food for a given period of time so that you can't be able to do that test. There are also, for example, pregnant women. You do these glucose intolerance tests. So you allow us not to eat before you go and do the glucose test. And then they will give you glucose and see how that glucose is broken down. And that can actually tell medical people if you are ending up with gestational diabetes or that's just diabetes when you're pregnant, or if you're not going to have gestational diabetes. So again, that could be one of the reasons why fasting can be carried out. There are also studies that have shown medically they've used things like intermittent fasting to try and control things like epilepsy. They've used it successfully with the obese patients to try and help prevent or reduce obesity. So there can be those health related reasons for fasting. Types of fast. So I'm going to talk a little bit about different types of fast that can be carried out. There can be what is called the partial fasting. And what partial fasting just means is, for example, you could decide I'm going to stay away from one meal and eat only 2 meals in a day. That's a partial fasting. Or you could decide I'm going to eat to two meal, not eat two meals and eat only one meal, which is basically the OMAD, 1 meal a day, which you might have heard about, or a lot of people do try. I've heard of people that swear with that being used as a method of weight loss. There is what is called the complete or the dry fast, where people decide and say, well, I'm not going to eat for X amount of time, not eating and drinking. So it's like complete abstinence from food. This is something that medically they don't really advise if you want to do this, to stay more than 3 days without food and drink, because your body can only be able to stay on its reserves for up to 3 days. And then there is the liquid fast, where you can decide you can only to have liquids or to drink, let's say, water for a given period of time. This is something that is well known, that you can actually go for up to 40 days on a liquid fast, where you're just drinking water and you still be able to survive, because your body will be breaking down the reserves. If you decide, for example, to go on a liquid fast, disclaimer or warning, please do not do it more than 40 days, because after 40 days your body basically goes into starvation, and it stops being in a way, it starts to eat itself up, because all the reserves are completely broken at that point. So when people fast, the first important thing is to realize that fasting involves a radical change of the cellular physiology and metabolism. So your body physiology and metabolism does change, because anyway, your body is expecting, if you wake up, let's say at 7, and you're used to having breakfast, the first thing you wake up and your body is expecting to be fueled at 7 a.m. If you're going to stay without eating, the body definitely is going to be changed in its physiology, and of course the cellular metabolism as well will change. Blood glucose normally provides the body with sufficient energy through glycolysis. So during a fast, maintenance of blood glucose levels initially relies on glycogen stores in the liver and the skeletal muscle. And what that just means is that at the beginning, your body will be relying on those stored glucose levels so that you can be able to fuel itself. A little bit about this. For example, as I mentioned before, you used to, when you wake up at 7, the first thing you have is your breakfast. So your body is waiting and saying, like, wait a minute, we're going to have something coming into our tummies at 7 in the morning. And then because you have made up your mind and decided you want to be fasting on this day, it so happens at 7, there is nothing. At 8, nothing. 9, nothing. 10, nothing. And the body begins to think, okay, so what is happening? Are we going to have any food, or are we not going to have any food? And so what it does, it begins to go into the reserves of the stores. Believe it or not, normally we eat quite a lot, and we have quite a lot of reserve of food in our body. So it starts to go into the body, and it starts to begin to scavenge for energy and to break this down so that it doesn't allow you to starve. So as the time continues, your body is literally starting to break down those reserved energies. So let's look a little bit about on the mechanism. So again, looking at these, the most important things that are important when it comes to fasting, or the principle is dependent on 3 types of energy metabolism. So that's glycogen, which is basically what you need through the Krebs cycle. I'm not going to go into all that details to start to explain what happens, but there's the glycogen, there's the fat that you usually store, and of course there are also the amino acids. So sorry, the glycogen is usually through the normal processes, where glycolysis, where you break down glucose, but also there is the amino acids through the Krebs cycle, where you begin to start to breaking down these as a result of not giving your food the normal energy. When it comes to the lipids or the fats, that's where people that usually recommend the ketogenic diet is where you starve your body of glucose, and then it goes into the process whereby it starts to make its new fat from fat, and the body undergoes ketogenesis, and that can begin to become a new fuel in itself, but something to talk about later on. So again, this is something that you can look at the differences when it comes to how your body synthesizes. So one of the other ways in which you can fast is intermittent fasting, where you're eating and then you're allowing yourself without food for a given window. It could be 8 hours, it could be 16 hours, and then you eat again. Evidence has shown that when done correctly, intermittent fasting can help with weight loss, it can help with lowering blood glucose, and that can help again to manage things like diabetes, etc. As I mentioned already, what you do is you're eating within a given window, and then what happens, and generally in fasting, you're feeding your body with glucose. So the glucose goes into the body, it starts to move through the bloodstream, it starts to be broken down, and once the glucose is broken down through the glycolysis process, that can be converted into glycogen. But also we have fats around the body. So in the fasted state, the glycogen can actually be converted into glucose and back and forth, and that is impacted depending on whether you have food or you don't have food. This can be a matter of time. It can take a bit of a while for this process to keep on going and stopping and things like that. But for example, people who are athletic or they do a lot of exercise, that can actually change. You also have the fatty acids, and these fatty acids can be broken down in the fasted state into ketones. And once they're broken down into ketones, that's where your body begins to have a new source of fuel, and that's going to be the ketone bodies that will be fueling your body in a sense. So this is something you can look at it and say, for example, when you're fasting, you're looking at the impact of insulin, glucose on the insulin. So you are eating some food and that's coming into your body. Insulin spikes at that state. So that spiking in insulin can actually result into like arenas issue, for example, issues to do with pre-diabetic. It can result in diabetes if your body is not able to control that insulin or because of insulin insensitivity. But the moment you now start to reduce and remove breakfast from the food, there is no insulin that is coming into the body, and as a result, of course, the glucose level is down. Because of the glucose level is down, insulin is down, and that can actually result in more sensitivity to insulin over a longer period of time. So that's why it is usually recommended for people who, let's say, are pre-diabetic or people who are trying to lose weight. You're kind of tricking around your insulin or increasing the insulin sensitivity because you're allowing your body to go for a long period of time in itself without proper fuel, of course, because you are in that fasted window where you're not going to be allowing yourself to eat something. Again, it's something to do with understanding how the body works well when it comes to it being starved of glucose. Able to eat for a longer period of time. When it comes to fasting, something that is important for you to realize, of course, you want to stay hydrated. You want to ensure that you have things like drinking a lot of fluids if you are on, let's say, the liquid first, or when you are on the dry one, you have to be very careful. And of course, again, it's something that you can do more regularly as something like a practice so that you can just help your body to break down excesses and things like that. And I'll talk a little bit about the benefits of fasting a little bit later. One of the other things you can do if you are fasting for a prolonged period of times, you can add like electrolytes in your drinks because you really want to, you might start losing some of these electrolytes during the processes of prolonged staying away from food. You may want to add things like fasting salts, which can provide the electrolytes, but even if you just have like normal salts that can provide you some of the electrolytes that you need. One thing that I would love to be to be very cautious about if you're fasting is sweeteners. Because what happens is that if you are having sweeteners, some of the sweeteners, where some people usually decide when they're fasting and say, like, if you're, let's say, addicted to sugary drinks or to sugar, you might decide, okay, I still want to drink tea and I want some sweetness in my tea. And what happens is that you can decide and say, okay, I'm going to take, instead of having my normal sugar or honey, I will have a sweetener. So I'm still in the fasted state. And that's like the worst decision you can ever make, because sweeteners, some of them have got a laxative effect. So if you're fasting, your gut is literally sleeping. Your gut is literally not sensitive anymore because you're not allowing food to come in. And when you are allowing yourself, of course, when it comes to these sweeteners, they say that they do not go to awaken the gut because they don't really have the calories, but then they can actually provide a laxative effect. And when this happens, and remember, you're not eating and things like that, this can actually irritate the gut or the bowel and can result in things like diarrhea, can result in quite very unpleasant surprises. So if you are fasting for particularly like long period of time, I will highly recommend, even if you do not want to have like an intake of sugar and things like that, drink lots of fluids, but you can use electrolytes. And if you feel like, for example, the water is tasteless and things like that, you can try things like herbal teas. Depends, of course, what is the purpose of your fasting, but do stay away from sweeteners.